The scream came from the training grounds, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet evening like a blade through silk. Lyra Voss dropped the bundle of herbs she was carrying and ran toward the sound, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone path. She rounded the corner near the old oak fence and stopped cold. Wren, the youngest daughter of Alpha King Draven Ashcroft, lay crumpled on the ground, blood soaking through the side of her small tunic. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes fluttered, unfocused, terrified. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. She had spent 3 years training as a healer under the pack's elder physician, and every instinct in her body told her to act first and think later. She dropped to her knees beside the child, pressing her palms against the wound, whispering calming words she barely remembered choosing. "Someone get the Alpha," she called out, her voice steady, despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Now, hurry." Within moments, guards arrived, torches lighting the darkening sky. Behind them came Draven Ashcroft himself, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd like a storm breaking over calm water. His eyes, gold and fierce even in human form, locked onto his daughter's still body, and for one terrible second, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories looked like nothing more than a frightened father. "Wren," his voice cracked on the single syllable. He knelt beside his daughter, gathering her gently against his chest, while Lyra continued to apply pressure to the wound. Her hands trembled now, but she did not stop working. She had seen injuries like this before, torn skin from claws, not from a fall, not from a stumble. But there was no time to explain that. There was only time to stop the bleeding. Behind Draven, a tall man with sharp cheekbones and calculating eyes watched the scene unfold. Cassian Hale, the Alpha's most trusted beta, stood with his arms crossed, his expression carefully blank. Only his eyes betrayed him, flicking nervously toward Lyra, toward Wren, toward the training equipment scattered nearby. Lyra noticed. She always noticed things others missed. It was a healer's gift, an eye trained to catch what was hidden beneath the surface. She saw the faint tremor in Cassian's jaw. She saw the way his hand rested against his side, as though hiding something. She saw, in the torchlight, a thin scratch along his forearm that had not been there that morning. But there was no time to think about that now. Wren needed her. "She'll live," Lyra said firmly, once the bleeding had slowed enough for her to breathe again. "The wound is deep, but it missed anything vital. She needs rest, and she needs to be kept warm." Draven lifted his daughter into his arms, as though she weighed nothing at all, his jaw tight, his eyes glassy with barely restrained fear. He turned to Lyra, his voice low and dangerous. "What happened here?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her neck. Lyra opened her mouth, unsure of what to say, unsure of how much she had truly seen, unsure if speaking the truth about Cassian's strange behavior would even matter without proof. And in that heartbeat of hesitation, her eyes met Cassian's. He did not plead. He did not beg. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw something she recognized immediately: the desperate terror of a man who had made a terrible mistake and did not know how to undo it. She thought of his mother, an elderly woman in the Eastern Quarter who depended entirely on her son's position within the pack. She thought of his younger siblings, still too young to fend for themselves. She thought of what exile would mean for a family with nothing else to fall back on. And she thought of her own life, solitary, unattached, with no one who depended on her the way Cassian's family depended on him. "It was me," she said quietly. The words left her mouth before she had fully decided to speak them, but once released, she could not call them back. Every eye in the clearing turned toward her. "I was training with her," Lyra continued, forcing her voice to remain steady, even as her stomach twisted into painful knots. "I lost control. I did not mean for this to happen." Draven's expression shifted from fear to something colder, something harder. He studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, but Lyra had learned long ago how to keep her expression still, how to mask her feelings behind a calm exterior. It was a skill that had served her well as a healer, comforting families through the worst news imaginable. Now it served a very different purpose. "You," Draven said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow louder than a shout. "You did this to my daughter." Yes, the lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but she held his gaze without flinching. The clearing fell utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what judgment the Alpha King would deliver. Lyra could feel dozens of eyes on her, pack members who had known her for years, who had trusted her with their wounds, their fevers, their childbirths. She watched their expressions shift from confusion to disbelief to something darker. "Take her healer's mark," Draven commanded, his voice cold enough to freeze the air itself. "She is stripped of her position, effective immediately. She will leave the main pack house before sunrise." 2 guards stepped forward. One of them, a young man named Owen who had once come to Lyra with a broken arm and left with a lifelong friendship, would not meet her eyes as he reached for the small pendant around her neck, the symbol of her healer's rank. He removed it gently, almost apologetically, and stepped back. Lyra felt the cold air rush against her now bare throat, a physical reminder of everything she had just lost. Years of study, years of sacrifice, years of building trust within a community that had never fully accepted an outsider like her to begin with, gone in the space of a single sentence. Draven turned away from her without another word, cradling his daughter against his chest as he strode toward the pack house, guards falling into formation around him. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, casting glances back at Lyra as though she were something dangerous, something to be feared. Only Cassian remained behind for a moment longer than the others. He approached her cautiously, his expression torn between relief and shame. "Why did you do that?" he whispered. Lyra looked at him steadily. "Because your family needs you. And because someone has to be able to walk away from this, it might as well be me. I will find a way to make this right," he promised, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't," Lyra said quietly. "If you confess now, it will look worse for both of us. Let it rest. Let it heal, like everything else does, eventually." She did not know, in that moment, just how long eventually might take. As Cassian disappeared into the darkness, Lyra remained standing alone in the training grounds, the torches slowly burning low around her. She looked down at her hands, still stained with Ren's blood, and allowed herself exactly one moment of grief before straightening her spine and beginning the long walk back to what had once been her home. She had until sunrise to gather her belongings. She intended to use every remaining minute of it. The pack house felt different already, colder somehow, as though the walls themselves had learned of her disgrace and turned against her. She moved quickly through the halls she had walked 1,000 times before, gathering only what she truly needed: a satchel of herbs, a change of clothes, the small carved wooden bird her late mother had given her many years ago. She paused at the doorway of the healing chamber, the room where she had spent countless nights tending to injured pack members, delivering babies, holding the hands of the dying. It had been the one place in the pack house where she had truly felt she belonged. Now it belonged to someone else. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Iris, the elderly healer who had trained her from childhood, stood in the corridor, her wrinkled face etched with concern. "Child," Iris said softly, "I do not believe you did this thing." "It does not matter what you believe," Lyra replied, forcing calm into her voice. "It only matters what the Alpha believes. You were always too willing to carry burdens that were not yours to carry," Iris said, shaking her head slowly. "Even as a girl, you would take the blame for broken pottery that was not your doing, simply to spare another child a scolding." Lyra managed a small, sad smile. Some habits do not fade with age. Iris reached into the pocket of her robe and withdrew a small pouch, pressing it into Lyra's hands. "Herbs, for wherever you end up. And this." She placed a folded piece of parchment on top of the pouch. "The location of a healer in the outer village, who owes me a great favor. She will not turn you away." "Thank you," Lyra whispered, her throat tightening with emotion she had been holding back all evening. "Be careful, child," Iris said, her eyes suddenly serious. "Whatever truly happened tonight, someone allowed you to take the blame for it. That is not the action of an honorable person." Lyra said nothing, unwilling to confirm or deny what Iris clearly already suspected. She embraced the old woman briefly, then continued down the corridor and out into the cold night air. By the time the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Lyra Voss had already left the boundaries of the main pack house behind her, walking the long dirt road that led toward the outer village, a settlement of lesser wolves who lived beyond the protection and comfort of the pack's inner circle. She carried everything she owned in a single satchel slung across her shoulder, and she did not look back. Behind her, in the pack house, Ren slept fitfully in her father's arms, her wound already beginning to close thanks to the swift care she had received. Draven sat beside his daughter's bed, long into the night, his mind replaying the scene at the training grounds over and over, searching for something that did not quite fit, though he could not yet identify what that something was. And in his own chambers across the compound, Cassian Hale stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat, as guilt settled into his bones, like a stone sinking slowly into still water. None of them knew, in that quiet, uneasy dawn, just how far the consequences of that single night would eventually reach, or how long it would take for the truth to finally claw its way to the surface. The outer village came into view just as the sun crested the distant hills, a scattering of modest wooden homes surrounded by fields and forest, far removed from the grandeur of the pack house Lyra had called home for most of her life. Smoke curled from a few early chimneys. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. Ordinary sounds, for an ordinary morning, though nothing about Lyra's life felt ordinary any longer. She found the address Iris had given her without much difficulty, a small cottage at the edge of the village, with a garden of medicinal herbs growing wild along its fence. An older woman answered the door, her expression guarded until Lyra mentioned Iris's name, at which point her posture softened considerably.
"Iris sent you,"
the woman said, more statement than question.
"I am Holly. Come in. Come in. You look like you have not slept." "I have not,"
Lyra admitted. Holly's cottage was small but warm, filled with the comforting scent of drying herbs and simmering broth. She gestured for Lyra to sit at a worn wooden table, while she busied herself preparing tea. "I heard what happened," Holly said carefully, not looking up from her work. "News travels fast, even to places as forgotten as this one." Lyra's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "Then you know I am no longer welcome within the main pack." "I know what they are saying happened," Holly corrected gently. "I have learned, over many years, that what people say happened, and what actually happened, are often two very different stories." Something in the older woman's tone made Lyra look up, searching her face for judgment or suspicion, but finding only quiet understanding instead. "You can stay here," Holly continued, setting a cup of steaming tea in front of her guest. "I have a spare room, small, but dry and warm enough. In exchange, you can help me with patients here in the village. We are always short of skilled hands, and yours, from what I understand, are quite skilled indeed." Relief washed over Lyra so suddenly that she had to blink back unexpected tears. "Thank you," she managed. "I do not know how I will ever repay this kindness." "You already have," Holly said with a small smile, "simply by being willing to accept it. Pride has kept many a good person suffering alone when they did not need to." As Lyra sipped her tea, warmth slowly returning to her chilled bones, she allowed herself to believe, for just a moment, that perhaps this new chapter of her life would not be as unbearable as she had feared during the long walk from the pack house. She did not yet know about the guards who would soon arrive at the village borders, spreading word among the villagers to keep their distance from the disgraced healer. She did not yet know how quickly whispers could turn into open hostility, how quickly a community could close ranks against an outsider marked with shame. She only knew, in that quiet morning hour, that she had made her choice, and she intended to live with its consequences without regret, no matter what those consequences might eventually become. Outside the cottage window, the village continued to wake, unaware that the woman inside would soon become the center of whispers that would echo far beyond the outer settlements, whispers that would eventually reach the ears of the one person capable of destroying her completely, or saving her entirely, depending on what he chose to believe when the truth finally came to light. The sun rose fully over the horizon now, casting long golden light across the fields, indifferent to the storm of secrets and sacrifice unfolding beneath it, indifferent to the fact that somewhere in that quiet village, a single act of selfless courage had just set in motion a chain of events that no one, not Lyra, not Cassian, not even the Alpha King himself, would be able to stop once it truly began to unfold. By mid-morning, Holly had already introduced Lyra to a handful of villagers who came seeking remedies for common ailments: a child with a persistent cough, an elderly man with joints that ached whenever the weather turned. Lyra worked quietly and efficiently, grateful for the distraction, grateful for hands that remembered their purpose even when everything else in her life felt uncertain. But word of her arrival spread quickly, faster than either woman had anticipated. By the time the sun reached its highest point, a small crowd had gathered near the cottage, not to seek healing, but to see for themselves the woman who had supposedly injured the Alpha King's youngest daughter. "That's her," a voice muttered from somewhere in the gathering. "The one who hurt the little pup." "Disgraceful," another added. "And they say Holly has taken her in, given her a place to stay." Lyra kept her eyes fixed on her work, grinding herbs into a fine paste for a woman's burned hand, refusing to let the whispers reach beneath her carefully maintained composure. She had expected this. She had known, from the moment she spoke those fateful words in the training grounds, that this would be her new reality. Still, hearing the venom in strangers' voices proved harder to bear than she had anticipated. "Pay them no mind," Holly said quietly, appearing at her side with a fresh bundle of bandages. "Villagers love nothing more than a fresh scandal to chew on. Give it a few weeks. They will find something else to occupy their tongues." "A few weeks," Lyra repeated softly. "That feels like a very long time to be looked at as though I am something dangerous." "You survived worse than idle gossip to get here," Holly said, her tone gentle but firm. "You will survive this too." As the afternoon wore on, the crowd eventually dispersed, though not before a young man threw a small stone that landed near Lyra's feet, more a gesture of contempt than genuine harm. She did not flinch. She simply continued her work, treating each patient with the same careful attention, regardless of the suspicion in their eyes. That evening, after the last patient had left, and the cottage had finally grown quiet, Lyra sat alone by the small fire, turning the carved wooden bird her mother had given her, over and over in her hands. She thought of her childhood, growing up in a small border settlement, before joining the Blackthorn Pack as an orphan teenager, with nothing but her wits and her determination to survive. She had trained under Iris for years, learning to read wounds the way others read books, learning to see the story written beneath torn skin and broken bones. It had given her purpose, a place in a world that had never quite felt like it belonged to her. And now, in a single evening, that purpose had been stripped away as easily as the pendant had been removed from her neck. She thought of Wren, small and frightened, bleeding in the dirt. Whatever else had happened that night, whatever secrets remained hidden in the shadows of the training grounds, the child's pain had been real, and Lyra did not regret stepping forward to help her. She only wondered, quietly, whether the sacrifice she had made would ever mean anything to anyone beyond herself. Miles away, within the walls of the pack house, Draven Ashcroft stood at the window of his daughter's chamber, watching over her sleeping form as the night deepened around them. Something continued to nag at the edges of his thoughts, a detail he could not quite grasp, a wrongness in the story he had been told that refused to settle comfortably into place. He had seen countless injuries over centuries of leading his pack. He knew the difference between a wound caused by an inexperienced healer's misjudged strength during training and a wound caused by something else entirely, something sharper, more deliberate. Lyra's confession had been swift, almost too swift, offered before anyone had even asked for an explanation. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself that grief and fear were clouding his judgment, that a confession was a confession, regardless of how quickly it had come. Yet even as he told himself this, some deeper instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless challenges to his rule, whispered that he was missing something important. He did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, nor how long it would take him to finally listen to it. 3 weeks passed before Lyra allowed herself to feel anything resembling stability in her new life. The villagers had not fully warmed to her, but the open hostility had softened into a wary tolerance, especially after she successfully treated a young farmer's infected leg wound, saving him from a fever that had already claimed 2 others in the settlement that season. Slowly, reluctantly, some of the villagers began to see her as something other than a disgraced healer from the pack house. They began to see her as useful, and in the outer village, being useful mattered more than reputation. Still, the losses weighed on her daily. She missed the healing chamber, with its shelves of carefully labeled remedies, and its familiar scent of dried lavender and crushed mint. She missed the friendships she had built over years within the pack, friendships that had evaporated the instant her healer's mark had been removed. Former colleagues who once shared meals with her, now looked away whenever their paths crossed near the market square that connected the outer village to the main settlement. Only one person seemed unaffected by the rumors surrounding her, and that person was far too young to understand the complicated politics that had led to Lyra's exile in the first place. It began with a small figure lingering near the edge of the market square one afternoon, watching Lyra from a distance as she purchased supplies from a traveling merchant. Lyra noticed the child immediately, small for her age, with a shock of dark hair and golden eyes that seemed strangely familiar, though she could not immediately place why. It was not until the girl stepped fully into the light that recognition struck her like a physical blow. Ren, the Alpha King's youngest daughter, stood barely 10 paces away, dressed in simple traveling clothes that did little to disguise her identity to anyone who had seen her even once before. She should not have been anywhere near the outer village. She should have been within the heavily guarded walls of the pack house, surrounded by nursemaids and protectors, recovering from an injury that had nearly cost her life only weeks earlier. Lyra's first instinct was panic. If anyone discovered the child wandering unsupervised near the very woman blamed for hurting her, the consequences would be severe, for both of them. She quickly finished her transaction with the merchant and moved toward Ren, crouching down to meet the girl's eyes directly. "You should not be here," Lyra said gently, glancing around to ensure no guards had noticed the child's presence. "Does your father know where you are?" Ren shook her head, her expression surprisingly solemn for a child her age. "I wanted to see you." "Why?" Lyra asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because you helped me," Ren said simply. "Everyone says you hurt me, but I remember you helping me. Your hands were warm, and you told me I would be all right, and I believed you, because your voice did not sound like someone who was lying." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected the child to remember anything from that chaotic night, let alone to draw such a clear distinction between the official story and her own fragmented memories. "You should return home before anyone notices you are missing," Lyra said carefully, unwilling to encourage the girl further, though her heart ached with a strange, unexpected tenderness toward the small figure standing before her. "It is not safe for you to wander so far alone. Will you walk with me part way?" Ren asked, her golden eyes hopeful, in a way that made it nearly impossible for Lyra to refuse. Against her better judgment, Lyra agreed, walking alongside the young girl toward the boundary that separated the outer village from the main pack territory, keeping careful watch for any sign of guards, or watchful eyes, that might report the encounter back to the Alpha King. "Does your side still hurt?" Lyra asked as they walked, unable to fully suppress her healer's instincts. "Sometimes," Ren admitted, "but Father says the pain will fade with time. He sits with me every night until I fall asleep. He has not left the pack house since it happened." A pang of something unfamiliar tugged at Lyra's chest, something that felt almost like sympathy for the man who had so swiftly condemned her. She pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that Draven Ashcroft had judged her without hesitation, without asking a single question, without granting her even a moment to explain herself. "I am glad you are healing well," Lyra said instead, keeping her tone neutral. They reached the edge of the forest that bordered the main pack territory, and Lyra stopped, unwilling to venture any closer to the pack house itself. "This is as far as I can safely go," she explained. "You must return the rest of the way alone, and quickly, before anyone realizes you have gone." Ren nodded, though reluctance flickered across her young face. "Will I see you again?" Lyra hesitated, torn between the practical wisdom of discouraging further visits and the surprising warmth she felt toward this small, determined child who had somehow seen through the lies surrounding her exile. "Perhaps," she said finally, unwilling to make promises she was not certain she could keep. "But you must be careful, Ren. If your father discovers you have been visiting me, it will only bring trouble for us both." "I will be careful," Ren promised, though something in her expression suggested she had already decided this would not be her final visit. Lyra watched the young girl disappear into the trees, her small form growing smaller until the forest swallowed her completely, before turning back toward the outer village, with a strange mixture of worry and unexpected hope settling in her chest. Over the following days, Ren returned twice more, always managing to slip away from her attendants during moments when their attention wavered, always finding her way to the market square, where she knew Lyra could often be found running errands or gathering supplies for Holly's cottage. Each time, Lyra tried to send the girl home quickly, aware of the danger such visits represented, yet each time she found herself unable to fully turn the child away. There was something healing in those brief encounters, something that reminded Lyra of the purpose she had lost when her healer's mark had been stripped away. Ren asked endless questions about herbs and remedies, about the stories behind old healing traditions, about the constellations visible in the night sky. She possessed a curiosity that reminded Lyra sharply of herself at that same age, eager to understand the world in all its complicated, beautiful detail. But such visits could not remain secret forever, and eventually, inevitably, someone noticed. It happened on a quiet afternoon when one of the pack's guards, a sharp-eyed young man named Nolan who had been assigned to watch over the pack house borders, spotted Ren slipping through a gap in the perimeter fence. He followed at a discreet distance, curiosity turning to alarm when he realized where the young princess was headed. He watched from the shadows as Ren approached a familiar figure near the edge of the market square, watched the disgraced healer crouch down to speak with the child, watched an exchange that appeared far too warm, far too familiar, for two people who supposedly had no connection beyond a single violent incident weeks earlier. Nolan did not confront either of them directly. Instead, he returned to the pack house as quickly as his legs would carry him, uncertain of what he had truly witnessed, but certain that the Alpha King needed to know his daughter had been secretly visiting the very woman blamed for her injury. That evening, as Lyra prepared dinner in Holly's small kitchen, unaware that her secret encounters had finally been discovered, a heavy knock sounded at the cottage door, sharp and commanding, in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. Holly answered, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she stepped back to reveal two armed guards standing in the doorway, their expressions grim and unreadable. "We need to speak with Lyra Voss," one of them announced, his voice leaving no room for refusal. "Alpha King's orders." Lyra's stomach dropped, a cold, sinking dread settling deep within her chest. Whatever the guards had come to discuss, she understood immediately that it could not be good news, not for a woman already living under the shadow of the Alpha's judgment. She stepped forward, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coiling tightly within her. "What has happened?" "The Alpha King requests your presence," the guard replied simply, offering no further explanation. "Immediately." Lyra glanced back at Holly, who offered a small, reassuring nod, despite the worry evident in her own expression, before following the two guards out into the darkening evening, her mind racing through every possible reason Draven Ashcroft might have summoned her back into his presence after weeks of silence. She did not know, as she walked the long road back toward the pack house she had once called home, that the summons had nothing to do with punishment for her secret meetings with Ren, and everything to do with a discovery that had finally begun to unravel the carefully constructed lie she had told to protect a man who did not deserve her sacrifice. The pack house loomed ahead of her in the darkness, its windows glowing with warm firelight that seemed almost mocking against the cold uncertainty twisting through her chest. Whatever waited for her within those walls, she understood there was no turning back now. She squared her shoulders and continued forward, prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her, though nothing could have truly prepared her for what she was about to discover. The guards led Lyra through corridors she had once walked freely, past rooms that held countless memories, now tainted by loss, until they reached the private study, where Draven Ashcroft conducted the most sensitive matters of pack business. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, firelight flickering from within, casting long shadows across the stone floor. One of the guards knocked once, then pushed the door open, gesturing for Lyra to enter alone. She stepped inside, her heart pounding steadily against her ribs, and found Draven standing near the window, his back turned toward her, hands clasped behind him in a posture of barely contained tension. "You wish to see me," Lyra said quietly, breaking the heavy silence that filled the room. Draven turned slowly, and for a moment, Lyra found herself unable to read the expression on his face, a complicated mixture of anger, confusion, and something else entirely, something that almost resembled uncertainty. "My daughter has been visiting you," he said, his voice carefully controlled, though the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "In the outer village, multiple times, according to my guards." Lyra's stomach twisted with worry, not for herself, but for Ren, who had only wanted a friend, a connection to someone who had shown her kindness during a frightening and painful time. "She came to me on her own," Lyra said carefully. I did not encourage her to leave the safety of the pack house. I tried to send her back each time. Yet she kept returning, Draven said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Why would a child return, again and again, to the person supposedly responsible for the worst injury of her young life? The question hung heavy in the air between them, and Lyra understood suddenly that this was not merely an interrogation about broken rules and disobedient children. This was something deeper, something that had clearly been troubling the Alpha King for far longer than the recent discovery of his daughter's secret visits. Perhaps, Lyra said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking across thin ice. She returned, because some part of her remembers something different than what she has been told happened. Draven's expression shifted, something flickering behind his golden eyes that Lyra could not quite identify. He crossed the room slowly, stopping directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the coolness of the evening air. I have spent every night since that incident replaying the scene in my mind, he said quietly, his voice low and measured. I have examined countless training injuries throughout my years leading this pack. I know the difference between a wound caused by inexperienced hands during a sparring exercise and a wound caused by something far more deliberate. Lyra's breath caught in her throat, dread pooling cold and heavy in her stomach. She had known, from the very beginning, that the lie she told would not hold indefinitely under close scrutiny. She had simply hoped it would hold long enough to protect Cassian and his family from immediate consequences, long enough for the matter to fade quietly from memory. The wound on my daughter's side was not consistent with an accidental strike from someone your size and strength, Draven continued, his eyes searching her face intently. It was deeper, more precise, made by someone with considerably more physical power than a healer, trained primarily in medicine rather than combat. I have trained in basic defense techniques, Lyra said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the weakness of her argument even to her own ears. Basic defense techniques do not produce wounds of that severity, Draven countered immediately. I have spoken with Iris. She confirms, you have never demonstrated the kind of physical strength necessary to cause such an injury, not even during your most rigorous combat training sessions. Lyra felt the careful walls of her deception beginning to crack beneath the weight of his relentless questioning. She had not anticipated Draven consulting Iris directly, had not considered that her former mentor's testimony might work against the very story she had constructed to protect someone else. Why would you speak with Iris about this? She asked, attempting to redirect the conversation, though she already sensed the futility of the effort. Because something about your confession never sat right with me, Draven admitted, his voice softening slightly, though the intensity in his eyes remained undiminished. You confessed too quickly, before anyone had even asked you a single question about what happened. Guilty parties rarely surrender themselves so readily, without hesitation, without any attempt to explain the circumstances that led to the incident. Lyra remained silent, unwilling to confirm his suspicions directly, yet equally unwilling to compound her original lie with additional false statements that might further endanger Cassian and his innocent family members. Tell me the truth, Draven said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, a tone Lyra had never heard him use before, not in all her years living within the pack house. Whatever happened that night, whatever reason drove you to claim responsibility for something I no longer believe you did, I need to understand the truth. For a long moment, Lyra remained silent, torn between the promise of relief that honesty might bring, and the fear of what consequences the truth might unleash upon someone who had trusted her to keep his secret safe. She thought of Cassian's aging mother, dependent entirely on her son's continued position within the pack. She thought of his younger siblings, still too young to survive without his support and protection. I cannot tell you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Frustration flickered across Draven's features, quickly replaced by something that looked almost like pain. Cannot, or will not. Does it matter? Lyra asked, meeting his gaze directly despite the vulnerability the action exposed. The result remains the same either way. Draven studied her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable once more, before finally stepping back and returning to his position near the window, his shoulders tense with barely suppressed frustration. You are protecting someone, he said, not quite a question, though clearly seeking confirmation nonetheless. Lyra said nothing, which proved answer enough for the perceptive Alpha King, standing before her, I will discover the truth eventually, he said quietly, his back still turned toward her. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they are buried. I only hope, when that truth finally emerges, the cost of your silence will not have proven too great for either of us to bear. May I return to the village now? Lyra asked, uncertain of what else remained to be said between them, uncertain of how much longer she could maintain her composure beneath the weight of his searching gaze. Draven nodded slowly, though he did not turn to face her again. You may go. But Lyra, he added, just as she reached the door, causing her to pause with her hand resting against the cool wood. Know that I intend to continue searching for answers. Whoever you are protecting, whatever reasons drove you to sacrifice your position and reputation to shield them, I will find the truth eventually. I always do. Lyra left the study without responding, her heart pounding heavily in her chest as she retraced her steps through the familiar corridors of the pack house, guards escorting her silently back toward the outer village she now called home. She did not know whether to feel relieved that her secret remained intact for now, or terrified by the certainty in Draven's voice when he promised to eventually uncover the truth she had worked so hard to conceal. As she walked, her thoughts turned inevitably toward Ren, toward the innocent friendship that had inadvertently brought Draven's suspicions to the surface after weeks of quiet uncertainty. She hoped the young girl would not face harsh punishment for her secret visits, hoped that whatever consequences arose from tonight's discovery would fall solely upon Lyra's own shoulders, rather than upon the innocent child who had simply sought comfort from someone who had shown her genuine kindness during a frightening time. Meanwhile, within the pack house, Draven remained standing at his window long after Lyra's departure, staring out into the darkness that had swallowed her retreating figure, his mind churning through possibilities he had not previously considered. Someone within his own pack, someone close enough to his daughter to have been present during that fateful training session, had caused Ren's injury and allowed an innocent woman to bear the consequences in their place. The realization settled over him like a physical weight, heavy with implications he was not yet prepared to fully confront. If Lyra had been protecting someone, that someone existed within his own circle of trust, someone he interacted with daily, someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than any wound inflicted by an outside enemy. He thought through the guards who had been present that evening, the pack members who typically supervised his daughter's training sessions, searching his memory for any detail that might point toward the true culprit hiding behind Lyra's carefully constructed lie. His thoughts drifted, almost unconsciously, toward Cassian, his most trusted beta, the man who had stood silently at the edge of the crowd that terrible night, watching the scene unfold with an expression Draven had dismissed at the time as simple concern for his alpha's well-being. He pushed the suspicion aside quickly, unwilling to entertain such thoughts about a man who had served him faithfully for years, who had proven his loyalty countless times throughout their long association. Surely Cassian would have come forward immediately if he possessed any knowledge relevant to Ren's injury. Surely such betrayal was simply beyond the realm of possibility for someone who had earned his complete trust through years of dedicated service. Yet even as he reassured himself, the seed of doubt had already been planted, quietly taking root within the fertile soil of his growing suspicions, waiting patiently for the right moment to fully bloom into certainty. Elsewhere within the pack house, unaware of the suspicions slowly gathering against him, Cassian sat alone in his private quarters, staring at the scratch marks along his forearm that had long since healed into faint, barely visible scars. He thought often of Lyra, of the sacrifice she had made on his behalf, of the guilt that continued to gnaw at his conscience, despite his attempts to bury it beneath the demands of daily pack business. He had told himself, in the weeks following the incident, that confessing the truth would only cause additional harm, that Lyra's exile, however unjust, at least protected his family from the devastating consequences his own confession would surely unleash. He clung to this justification desperately, using it as a shield against the mounting weight of his own conscience, though deep down, in the quietest hours of the night, he understood the excuse for the cowardice it truly represented. He did not yet know that his alpha's suspicions had already begun turning in his direction, did not know that the careful lie he had allowed Lyra to construct on his behalf was beginning to unravel beneath Draven's relentless scrutiny. He only knew that guilt continued to weigh upon him like a stone he could not set down, growing heavier with each passing day that he allowed an innocent woman to suffer in his place. The night deepened around the pack house, wrapping its inhabitants in uneasy silence, each carrying secrets and suspicions that would eventually, inevitably, collide with devastating consequences none of them could yet fully anticipate. Despite the danger of discovery, Ren found new ways to continue her secret visits over the following weeks, though she grew more careful, timing her escapes to moments when her father was occupied with pack business and her attendants distracted by other duties. Lyra, aware of the risks such continued visits presented, made repeated attempts to discourage the young girl, yet found herself increasingly unable to turn away the child who had become, against every logical expectation, one of the few genuine sources of warmth in her otherwise isolated existence. Their meetings grew shorter but more frequent, brief exchanges near the market square, or along the edges of the forest that bordered the outer village, always cautious, always aware of watching eyes that might report their continued connection back to the Alpha King. Ren spoke often of her recovery, of the lingering discomfort that occasionally flared along her healing wound, of the nightmares that sometimes disturbed her sleep, fragments of memory she could not fully piece together into coherent understanding. "I keep seeing shadows," Ren confided during one such meeting, her small hands twisting nervously in her lap as they sat together on a fallen log near the forest's edge. "Two shadows, moving quickly, before everything goes dark and painful. But when I try to remember faces, everything blurs together." Lyra listened carefully, her healer's instincts recognizing the value of allowing traumatic memories to surface naturally, rather than forcing recollection before the mind was ready to process such difficult experiences. "Memories often return slowly after a frightening event," she explained gently. "There is no need to force yourself to remember everything immediately. Your mind is protecting you, allowing pieces to return only when you are ready to understand them." "Do you think I will ever remember exactly what happened?" Ren asked, her golden eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and lingering fear. "Perhaps," Lyra said honestly, "or perhaps some details will remain forever unclear. Either way, what matters most is that you continue healing, both the wound on your body and whatever fear remains within your mind." Ren nodded slowly, though her expression suggested the answer had not fully satisfied her curiosity. She had inherited her father's determined nature, apparently, along with his golden eyes and stubborn persistence in seeking answers to questions others preferred to leave unexplored. During these quiet moments together, Lyra found herself sharing pieces of her own history that she rarely discussed with anyone. Stories of her childhood in the border settlement, before joining the Blackthorn Pack. Memories of her mother's gentle hands, teaching her the earliest lessons in herbal medicine, before illness claimed her life, when Lyra was barely older than Ren herself. "Is that why you became a healer?" Ren asked one afternoon, listening intently, as Lyra described the small wooden bird her mother had carved for her many years earlier. "Because of your mother?" "Partly," Lyra admitted, a soft, wistful smile touching her lips. "I wanted to save others from the pain of losing someone, the way I lost her. I wanted to feel useful, to feel as though my hands could accomplish something meaningful, in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable." "You are still useful," Ren said firmly, with the simple conviction only a child could offer, without hesitation or complication. "Even here, even without your healer's mark, you still help people. I have seen you treating villagers near the market square." Lyra's chest tightened with unexpected emotion at the young girl's words, a reminder that her worth as a healer had never truly depended on the pendant that had been stripped from her neck weeks earlier. That worth existed within her hands, within her knowledge, within her willingness to help those who needed her, regardless of official titles or formal recognition. "Thank you," Lyra said quietly, genuinely touched by the child's perceptive kindness. As their bond continued to deepen through these secret meetings, Ren began bringing small gifts during her visits. Wildflowers gathered along the path. A smooth river stone she claimed brought good fortune. A sketch she had drawn depicting the two of them sitting together beneath the forest canopy. Lyra treasured each small offering, keeping them carefully within her modest room at Holly's cottage, tangible reminders that despite everything she had lost, she had somehow gained an unexpected friendship with a child whose innocent trust remained unwavering, despite the confusing circumstances surrounding their initial connection. Yet even as their friendship deepened, the danger surrounding their continued meetings grew increasingly precarious. Nolan, the guard who had first discovered Ren's secret visits, continued monitoring the situation closely, uncertain whether to report the ongoing meetings to the Alpha King, torn between his duty to inform his leader and his reluctance to potentially cause further trouble for a young princess, who seemed genuinely happier following her interactions with the disgraced healer. He mentioned his continued observations cautiously to Draven during a private conversation one evening, careful to present the facts without embellishment or speculation regarding motives he did not fully understand. "She continues visiting the healer," Nolan reported, standing at attention within Draven's private study. "Despite our previous conversation with the healer regarding the matter, should I intervene more forcefully to prevent further contact?" Draven considered the question carefully, his mind still turning over the unresolved suspicions that had continued growing since his confrontation with Lyra weeks earlier. Part of him understood he should forbid the continued meetings entirely, should protect his daughter from further contact with a woman whose true role in the injury remained uncertain. Yet another part of him, the part that had noticed his daughter's improved mood and reduced nightmares following her secret visits, hesitated to fully sever a connection that appeared to be genuinely benefiting Ren's emotional recovery. "Continue monitoring the visits," Draven instructed finally, "but do not intervene unless you observe anything that suggests genuine danger to my daughter's safety. I wish to understand this connection more fully before making any final decisions regarding its continuation." Nolan nodded, though confusion flickered briefly across his features before he quickly schooled his expression back into professional neutrality. "Understood, my alpha." As Nolan departed, Draven remained alone with his thoughts, increasingly troubled by the complexity of a situation that continued resisting the straightforward resolution he desperately sought. Every instinct told him something remained fundamentally wrong with the official story surrounding his daughter's injury, yet every attempt to uncover the deeper truth met with the same wall of silent protection that Lyra had erected around whoever she continued shielding from consequences. He found himself, against his better judgment, growing increasingly curious about the woman herself, about the depth of loyalty or love that could drive someone to sacrifice their entire life's work and reputation to protect another person's secret. Such devotion seemed almost incomprehensible to a man who had spent centuries navigating the complicated, often treacherous politics of pack leadership, where loyalty frequently proved conditional, easily abandoned when circumstances shifted toward greater personal advantage. Yet Lyra had shown no signs of regret, no indication that she wished to recant her original confession, despite weeks of hardship and social isolation within the outer village. Whatever bond connected her to the true culprit behind Ren's injury, it apparently ran deep enough to withstand significant personal sacrifice without wavering. Draven found himself wondering, in quiet, unguarded moments, what it might feel like to inspire such unwavering loyalty and protection from another person, a thought that surprised him with its unexpected vulnerability, quickly pushed aside beneath the weight of more pressing pack concerns that demanded his continued attention. Meanwhile, in the outer village, Lyra remained unaware of the internal conflict continuing to unfold within the Alpha King's mind, unaware of his private instructions to Nolan permitting her continued meetings with Ren to proceed unimpeded. She simply continued her quiet existence, treating patients alongside Holly, cherishing her secret visits with the young princess who had become an unexpected source of comfort during an otherwise difficult period of exile and isolation. She did not yet understand how significantly these small, seemingly innocent meetings would eventually contribute to unraveling the careful deception she had constructed weeks earlier, nor how quickly circumstances beyond her control would soon force the truth into the open, regardless of her continued determination to protect Cassian's secret at whatever personal cost such protection demanded. The autumn winds began growing colder as the season progressed, carrying with them subtle signs of the challenges that lay ahead. Challenges that would soon test the strength of every character caught within this tangled web of loyalty, deception, and slowly awakening truth. Determined to uncover the truth his instincts insisted remained hidden beneath the surface of his daughter's official story, Draven began a quiet, methodical investigation of his own, conducted carefully to avoid alerting whoever might be responsible for concealing the truth from him. He started by revisiting the training grounds themselves, walking the exact path his daughter would have taken that fateful evening, searching for any physical evidence that might have been overlooked during the initial chaos and confusion. The training equipment remained largely unchanged since the incident, wooden practice weapons stacked neatly against the fence, training dummies positioned at various distances for combat drills. Draven examined each item carefully, running his fingers along wooden surfaces, searching for any sign of blood or damage that might indicate the true source of his daughter's injury. He found nothing immediately obvious, though something about the positioning of the equipment continued to nag at his attention. Ren had been found near the eastern edge of the training grounds, yet the sparring area typically used for supervised practice sessions lay considerably farther west, closer to the main pack house. Why would his daughter have wandered so far from the designated training area, particularly during evening hours, when she should have been accompanied by supervision at all times? He began questioning pack members who had been present that evening, starting with the guards who had first responded to the scene, then expanding his inquiries to include anyone who might have witnessed his daughter's movements earlier in the evening before the injury occurred. Most provided little additional information beyond what he already knew, confirming only that chaos had erupted suddenly, with Lyra already kneeling beside his daughter by the time most witnesses arrived at the scene. One conversation, however, proved unexpectedly revealing. A young kitchen servant named Grace mentioned, almost in passing, that she had seen Cassian walking briskly away from the eastern training grounds shortly before the commotion began, moving with an urgency that had struck her as unusual for the typically composed and measured Beta. "I did not think much of it at the time," Grace admitted, wringing her hands nervously beneath Draven's intense scrutiny. "Betas often move quickly between duties. I only remembered the detail because he seemed unusually flustered, not his typical calm self at all." Draven thanked the young servant for her observation, careful to maintain a neutral expression despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. The detail aligned precisely with the growing suspicion he had been reluctant to fully acknowledge, that his most trusted Beta might somehow bear responsibility for the injury that had nearly cost his daughter her life. He continued his investigation with renewed determination, examining Cassian's recent behavior more closely, noting the subtle changes he had perhaps unconsciously dismissed in the weeks following the incident. Cassian had grown quieter during pack meetings, more withdrawn during casual conversations, occasionally distracted during discussions that would have previously commanded his full attention. Small changes, easily overlooked individually, yet collectively painting a picture of a man burdened by significant unspoken guilt. Draven arranged a private meeting with Cassian, under the pretense of discussing routine pack business, watching carefully for any additional signs that might confirm or dispel his growing suspicions. Cassian arrived punctually, as always, though Draven noticed immediately the slight tension in his Beta's shoulders, the careful way he avoided prolonged eye contact throughout their conversation. "Is something troubling you?" Draven asked casually, midway through their discussion of upcoming pack matters, watching Cassian's reaction with careful attention. "Nothing beyond the usual concerns of pack management," Cassian replied smoothly, though his hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the edge of the table between them. "You seem distracted lately," Draven pressed gently, keeping his tone conversational rather than accusatory. "Since the incident with Ren, particularly, is there something you wish to discuss with me?" For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Cassian's carefully composed expression: fear, guilt, perhaps both intertwined together, before he quickly regained control of his features. "The incident troubled us all deeply, my Alpha. I simply worry for your daughter's continued well-being, as any loyal member of this pack would." Draven studied his Beta carefully, searching for any additional cracks in the careful composure Cassian had maintained throughout their conversation, yet finding none significant enough to justify direct confrontation, without additional concrete evidence. He decided, ultimately, to continue his investigation more patiently, gathering further proof before risking a direct accusation that could permanently damage his relationship with a Beta he had trusted for years, should his suspicions ultimately prove unfounded. "Of course," Draven said finally, allowing the conversation to shift back toward routine pack matters, though his mind continued turning over the accumulating evidence, pointing increasingly toward Cassian's involvement in the incident. Following their meeting, Draven sought additional counsel from Iris, the elderly healer, whose decades of experience treating pack members had granted her considerable insight into the nature of various injuries and their likely causes. He described his daughter's wound in careful detail, watching Iris's weathered face for any reaction that might confirm his growing suspicions. "You are correct that the wound pattern suggests someone with considerably more physical strength than young Lyra possesses," Iris confirmed thoughtfully, after listening carefully to Draven's detailed description. The depth and precision suggest claws rather than a training weapon, wielded by someone experienced in combat, someone who perhaps lost control during a moment of heightened emotion or unexpected provocation. Could such an injury occur accidentally? Draven asked, still searching for any explanation that might exonerate Cassian without requiring further painful confrontation. Accidents happen even among skilled fighters, Iris acknowledged. Though typically such accidents occur during supervised sparring between individuals of comparable strength and experience, not between a young pup and an adult wolf, considerably more powerful than she. The implication hung heavy in the air between them, and Draven found himself forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility he had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. If Cassian had indeed caused his daughter's injury, even accidentally during some unexplained confrontation, the beta's subsequent silence and willingness to allow an innocent woman to bear the consequences represented a betrayal far more serious than the original injury itself. "Thank you, Iris," Draven said quietly, his mind already racing ahead toward the difficult decisions that lay before him. "Your insight has proven invaluable." As Iris departed, Draven remained alone in his study, wrestling with the weight of his accumulating suspicions. He understood he needed additional concrete evidence before confronting Cassian directly, evidence substantial enough to justify the serious consequences such an accusation would inevitably trigger, both for Cassian's standing within the pack and for the broader stability of leadership that depended heavily on trusted relationships between an alpha and his closest advisors. He decided, ultimately, to focus his continued investigation on locating additional witnesses who might have observed the actual incident, rather than merely its immediate aftermath. Someone, somewhere within the pack, likely possessed knowledge of what had truly transpired that evening, knowledge that remained hidden, either through fear of the consequences such disclosure might trigger, or through misplaced loyalty toward whoever bore true responsibility for the incident. His search led him eventually to a young trainee named Derek, who had been practicing alone in a secluded section of the training grounds that evening, close enough to potentially have witnessed relevant details, yet far enough removed from the immediate area to have escaped notice during the initial chaos following the discovery of Ren's injury. Derek proved reluctant initially to share what he had observed, clearly frightened by the implications of contradicting the official story that had already been established regarding the incident. Only after Draven assured him repeatedly that his honesty would not result in punishment did the young trainee finally begin describing what he had witnessed that evening. "I saw the young princess wandering alone near the eastern boundary," Derek explained hesitantly, "which struck me as unusual, since she typically remained closely supervised during evening hours. I was about to approach and escort her back toward the main training area, when I saw Beta Cassian approaching from the opposite direction." "Continue," Draven urged, his pulse quickening with anticipation. They spoke briefly, though I could not hear their words clearly from my position. The conversation seemed to grow heated rather quickly. Then everything happened very fast, too fast for me to fully process what I was witnessing. I heard the princess cry out, saw Beta Cassian step back suddenly, and then I ran to fetch help, arriving just as others began gathering at the scene. The confirmation Draven had been seeking, painful though it proved to receive, finally settled the last remaining doubts regarding his Beta's involvement in the incident. Cassian had indeed been present during the moment of his daughter's injury, had likely caused the wound himself during some manner of confrontation that had escalated beyond his control, and had subsequently allowed an innocent woman to sacrifice her position and reputation to shield him from the consequences of his actions. "Why did you not come forward with this information sooner?" Draven asked, though his tone remained gentle rather than accusatory, understanding the fear that had likely kept the young trainee silent throughout the preceding weeks. "I was frightened," Derek admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Beta Cassian holds considerable influence within the pack. I worried what consequences might follow if I contradicted his authority without absolute certainty regarding what I had witnessed." "You have done the right thing now," Draven assured him, "and your honesty will not be forgotten. Speak of this conversation to no one else, until I determine the appropriate course of action moving forward." Derek nodded gratefully, visible relief washing over his young features now that his burden of silence had finally been shared with someone capable of addressing the troubling situation appropriately. As Derek departed, Draven remained alone once more, processing the full weight of what he had discovered. His most trusted beta had betrayed him, not merely through causing his daughter's injury, but through the far greater betrayal of allowing an innocent woman to suffer severe consequences in his place, consequences that included social isolation, loss of professional standing, and considerable personal hardship within the challenging conditions of the outer village. He thought of Lyra, of her unwavering silence despite weeks of difficult questioning, of the sacrifice she continued making, even now, to protect someone who clearly did not deserve such profound loyalty. Something within him shifted uncomfortably at the realization, a complicated mixture of anger toward Cassian's betrayal and growing respect for Lyra's remarkable strength of character. He resolved to gather additional evidence before confronting Cassian directly, wanting absolute certainty before disrupting the delicate balance of trust that had governed their working relationship for years. Yet even as he made this decision, circumstances beyond his control were already beginning to accelerate toward a crisis that would soon force his hand, regardless of his careful, methodical approach, to uncovering the complete truth. Far beyond the borders of the Blackthorn Pack's territory, dangerous forces had begun gathering, forces that would soon test every character within this unfolding drama in ways none of them could yet fully anticipate, forces that would ultimately prove instrumental in finally bringing the truth fully into the light, regardless of how carefully it had been concealed until that point. The first warning came at dusk, when a breathless scout stumbled through the gates of the outer village, his clothing torn, his eyes wide with alarm. Rogue wolves, wolves without pack allegiance, without territory, without the structure and protection that came with belonging to an established community, had been spotted moving through the forest to the north, their numbers far greater than any scouting party the region had encountered in recent memory. Word spread through the village with startling speed, panic rippling from household to household, as families began gathering their most essential belongings, preparing for the possibility of evacuation toward the safer, more heavily fortified main pack territory. Holly's cottage became a temporary gathering point for several worried neighbors, seeking advice and reassurance from the woman whose decades of experience within the village had earned considerable respect and trust. "How many rogues are we discussing?" Lyra asked, helping Holly organize emergency medical supplies in preparation for whatever violence the night might bring. "Scouts report at least 20, possibly more," Holly replied grimly, her weathered hands moving efficiently despite the tension evident in her expression. "Led by someone called Derek Thorne, a rogue commander known for targeting vulnerable border settlements exactly like ours." A cold weight settled in Lyra's stomach as she absorbed the implications of Holly's words. The outer village possessed minimal defensive capabilities compared to the heavily fortified main pack territory, relying primarily on the deterrent effect of proximity to the larger, more powerful Blackthorn Pack, rather than any significant independent defenses of its own. "Will the pack send reinforcements?" Lyra asked, though uncertainty colored her voice, aware that her own exile from the main territory might complicate any assumption of automatic protection extending toward her current place of residence. "They should," Holly said, though her tone lacked complete confidence. "The outer village remains technically under Blackthorn protection, regardless of the informal status many of us hold within the broader pack structure. But rogue attacks move quickly, faster than reinforcements can typically arrive from the main territory." As the evening deepened into full darkness, the sounds of approaching conflict began reaching the village, distant howls and the crash of breaking branches carrying ominously through the cool night air. Villagers who possessed any combat training gathered near the settlement's perimeter, armed with whatever weapons they could muster, preparing to defend their homes against forces considerably more experienced and dangerous than their own limited defensive capabilities could reasonably withstand. Lyra found herself thrust immediately into the role she knew best, tending to the first wounded villagers who stumbled back from the perimeter as the initial skirmishes began, injuries mounting rapidly as the rogue force pressed deeper into the settlement's boundaries. She worked with practiced efficiency despite the chaos surrounding her, cleaning wounds, stopping bleeding, offering calm reassurance to frightened villagers who had never before experienced the true violence of a coordinated rogue assault. Word of the attack reached the main pack house within the hour, carried by a swift messenger who had witnessed the initial confrontation before racing to alert Draven of the developing crisis. The Alpha King mobilized his forces immediately, gathering his most capable warriors to march toward the outer village's defense, understanding the strategic and moral imperative of protecting territory that remained under his authority, regardless of its distance from the main settlement. As Draven prepared to depart, his thoughts turned unexpectedly toward Lyra, toward her safety within a village now under direct threat from dangerous rogue forces. He pushed the concern aside, telling himself it stemmed purely from his ongoing investigation into her continued protection of Cassian, rather than any deeper personal concern for her individual well-being. Yet the thought lingered, more persistent than he cared to fully acknowledge, as he led his warriors swiftly through the darkening forest toward the besieged settlement. Back within the outer village, the situation continued deteriorating rapidly, as rogue fighters pushed deeper into the settlement's limited defenses, overwhelming the village's inexperienced defenders through sheer numbers and combat expertise. Lyra's small medical station, established within Holly's cottage, quickly filled beyond capacity, wounded villagers arriving faster than she and Holly could adequately treat their injuries. "We need more hands," Holly said urgently, wiping blood from her own weathered hands as she moved between patients. "I cannot manage this volume alone, even with your assistance." Lyra nodded grimly, understanding the desperate mathematics of triage that now governed their efforts, prioritizing the most severe injuries while managing less critical wounds as efficiently as possible, given their limited resources and time. She thought briefly of the healing chamber she had once commanded within the main packhouse, with its abundant supplies and additional trained assistants readily available during emergencies. Such resources felt impossibly distant now, replaced by the harsh reality of a small cottage struggling to accommodate far more patients than it had ever been designed to hold. As the night wore on, a particularly severe injury arrived at their makeshift medical station, one of the village's few trained guards, gravely wounded during a direct confrontation with rogue fighters near the settlement's northern perimeter. Lyra recognized him immediately as Owen, the same young guard who had once removed her healer's pendant during her disgrace weeks earlier, the same man who had treated her with quiet respect, despite his official duty that painful evening. "Please," his companions urged desperately, carrying his limp form into the already overcrowded cottage. "He is losing too much blood." Lyra sprang immediately into action, examining the severity of Owen's wounds with practiced efficiency, despite the exhaustion beginning to weigh heavily upon her from hours of continuous treatment. The injury proved severe, a deep gash along his side that had already caused significant blood loss, threatening his life, if not addressed immediately and effectively. "I need boiling water and clean cloth. Quickly," Lyra instructed, already applying pressure to slow the dangerous bleeding, while Holly rushed to gather the requested supplies. She worked with focused intensity over the following crucial minutes, drawing upon every technique she had learned throughout years of dedicated training, determined not to lose this patient, and despite the severity of his condition and the limited resources available within their overwhelmed medical station. Gradually, painstakingly, she managed to stabilize the dangerous bleeding, cleaning and closing the wound with careful, practiced precision, despite her trembling, exhausted hands. "He will live," she announced finally, relief washing through her exhausted body as Owen's breathing gradually steadied, his color slowly returning, despite the significant blood loss he had sustained. "He needs rest and continued monitoring, but the immediate danger has passed." The guards who had carried him to safety expressed profound gratitude, their earlier suspicion and distance toward Lyra dissolving in the face of her evident skill and dedication during the crisis. Word of her successful treatment began spreading quickly through the beleaguered village, villagers who had previously regarded her with wary suspicion, now recognizing the genuine value of her continued presence within their community. As dawn began breaking over the horizon, Draven's reinforcements finally arrived, pushing back the remaining rogue fighters through coordinated, decisive combat that quickly turned the tide of the extended confrontation. The rogue commander, recognizing the shifting balance of power, ordered a hasty retreat, his remaining fighters melting back into the surrounding forest as quickly as they had first appeared the previous evening. Draven moved immediately through the village, upon securing the perimeter, checking on the well-being of residents and coordinating continued defensive measures should the rogues attempt a renewed assault in the coming days. His search eventually led him toward Holly's cottage, where he found Lyra still tending to patients, despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her weary posture. Her hands still stained with the blood of countless villagers she had worked tirelessly throughout the night to save. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a long moment before she noticed his presence, struck by the quiet dedication evident in her continued efforts despite obvious physical exhaustion. This was not the behavior of someone who had callously injured a child during a moment of reckless carelessness. This was someone whose entire being remained oriented toward healing and protecting others, regardless of personal cost or previous mistreatment, at the hands of those she now worked so tirelessly to save. "Lyra," he said finally, his voice softer than she had heard it since before the incident that had originally torn apart her position within the pack. She looked up, startled by his unexpected presence, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes, in the slight tremor still visible in her blood-stained hands. "Alpha King," she acknowledged, straightening despite her obvious fatigue. "You saved many lives tonight," Draven said, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious, despite the chaos and exhaustion surrounding them both, including one of my own guards. "I did what any healer would do," Lyra replied simply, though a note of pride crept into her tired voice, despite her attempt at modesty. Draven stepped further into the cottage, surveying the scene of organized chaos, wounded villagers resting on makeshift bedding, supplies scattered across every available surface, evidence of a long night spent fighting desperately to preserve life against overwhelming odds. "This village owes you a considerable debt," he said quietly. "I ask for nothing in return," Lyra said, though weariness had begun eroding the careful composure she typically maintained during their infrequent interactions. "I only wish to help those who needed assistance, regardless of past circumstances between us." Something shifted in Draven's expression as he studied her, a complicated mixture of admiration and growing certainty that whatever truth remained hidden regarding his daughter's original injury, this remarkable woman standing before him, exhausted and blood-stained, yet still radiating quiet strength and dedication, deserved far better treatment than the harsh judgment he had originally imposed upon her. "Rest now," he said finally, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it directed toward her. "You have done more than enough for one night. I will ensure additional healers arrive from the main pack house to assist with the continued recovery efforts." Lyra nodded gratefully, too exhausted to fully process the significant shift in his demeanor toward her, though somewhere beneath her overwhelming fatigue, she registered the change with cautious, uncertain hope that perhaps, finally, the tide of circumstances might be beginning to turn in her favor, after weeks of difficult isolation and unjust suspicion. Neither of them yet knew how quickly the remaining pieces of truth would soon fall into place, nor how dramatically the events of this long, difficult night would ultimately contribute toward finally unraveling the careful deception that had governed their complicated relationship since that fateful evening, weeks earlier, when Lyra had first sacrificed everything to protect a secret that no longer deserved her continued loyalty. In the days following the rogue attack, the outer village slowly began rebuilding, damaged structures repaired, wounded villagers continuing their recovery under the combined efforts of Lyra, Holly, and the additional healers Draven had promptly dispatched from the main pack house as promised. The atmosphere within the settlement had shifted noticeably, suspicion and wariness toward Lyra, replaced by genuine gratitude and growing respect for the woman who had worked tirelessly to save countless lives during the crisis. Yet even as the village recovered, Ren continued struggling with disturbed sleep, the trauma of her original injury compounded now by the fear and chaos of the recent rogue attack that had threatened the broader safety of the pack's territory. Her nightmares grew more frequent and more vivid, fragments of memory finally beginning to surface with greater clarity than she had previously been able to access. One evening, several days after the rogue attack had been successfully repelled, Ren woke screaming from a particularly vivid nightmare, her small body trembling as her father rushed immediately to her bedside, gathering her gently into his arms, as he had done countless times since her original injury. "Tell me what you saw," Draven urged softly, once her trembling had subsided enough for coherent conversation, sensing that this particular nightmare had revealed something significant that his daughter's mind had previously kept carefully hidden. Ren hesitated, her golden eyes wide with lingering fear and confusion, before finally beginning to describe the fragmented memory that had haunted her sleep. "I was walking near the training grounds," she said slowly, working to piece together images that remained frustratingly incomplete. "I was looking for you, but I could not find you anywhere." Then Beta Cassian appeared, and he seemed angry about something, though I do not remember what. Draven's entire body tensed, though he forced himself to remain calm and patient, unwilling to interrupt his daughter's fragile recollection, with visible reaction that might cause her to retreat back into silence. "What happened next?" he asked gently. "He told me I should not be wandering alone, that it was dangerous," Ren continued, her voice growing more confident as the memory solidified with greater clarity. "I told him I was looking for you. He seemed nervous, kept glancing around, as though watching for someone. Then I tried to walk past him, and he grabbed my arm, too roughly, and I pulled away, and then—" She paused, her small face crumpling with distress, as the final piece of memory finally surfaced, fully into conscious recollection. "Then what, Ren?" Draven pressed gently, though his heart pounded heavily with anticipation and dread combined. "He did not mean to hurt me," Ren said finally, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "I think he was trying to stop me from running toward the forest, worried something might happen to me if I wandered too far alone." But his claws, they extended without him meaning them to, the way they sometimes do when a wolf becomes startled or upset. "I do not think he wanted to hurt me. I think it was an accident that frightened him terribly." Draven held his daughter close, processing the significant revelation with complicated emotions swirling through his mind. Cassian had indeed caused the injury, exactly as he had begun to suspect through his careful investigation, yet Ren's account suggested the incident had resulted from a genuine accident rather than any deliberate malice, panic and startled reflexes, combining unfortunately, rather than any true intent to harm the young princess. This did not excuse Cassian's subsequent cowardice, however. His willingness to allow Lyra to bear the full consequences of an incident he himself had caused, regardless of whether that original incident had been accidental or deliberate. "Why did Lyra say she was the one who hurt you?" Ren asked, her young mind clearly working through the confusing implications of her newly recovered memory. "If Beta Cassian caused the injury, why did she take the blame instead?" "That is an excellent question," Draven said quietly, "and one I intend to have answered very soon." He tucked his daughter back into bed, remaining beside her until she finally drifted into peaceful sleep, her nightmares apparently resolved now that the fragmented memory had finally surfaced into full clarity. As he watched her sleep, Draven's mind churned through the implications of what he had just learned, anger toward Cassian's cowardly betrayal mixing with growing admiration for Lyra's continued sacrifice on behalf of a man who clearly did not deserve such profound loyalty. He understood now, with complete certainty, exactly what course of action he needed to pursue. The time for careful, patient investigation had passed. The time for direct confrontation had finally arrived. The following morning, Draven summoned Cassian to his private study, his expression carefully controlled despite the barely contained fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. Cassian arrived promptly, though something in his alpha's rigid posture and unreadable expression immediately set his nerves on edge, some instinctive awareness suggesting this meeting would prove considerably different from their previous conversations regarding routine pack business. "Close the door," Draven instructed, his voice carrying an edge of controlled intensity that Cassian had rarely heard, directed toward him throughout their years of association. Cassian complied, his hands trembling slightly as he secured the heavy wooden door, some deep instinctive part of him already suspecting the true purpose behind this unexpected summons. "My daughter remembered something important last night," Draven said, once the door had closed completely, sealing them both within the private confines of his study. Something about the evening of her injury that she had previously been unable to recall clearly. Cassian's face drained of color, though he attempted, unsuccessfully, to maintain his composed exterior despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "What did she remember?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "She remembered you, Cassian," Draven said, his golden eyes fixed intently on his Beta's increasingly panicked expression. "She remembered your claws extending unexpectedly, during a moment of startled reaction, causing the wound that nearly cost her life. She remembered the truth that Lyra has been protecting through weeks of unjust exile and social isolation." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, thick with the weight of finally acknowledged truth, broken only by Cassian's ragged breathing, as the full implications of his exposed betrayal settled over him, like a physical weight he could no longer avoid or deny. "My alpha," he began, his voice cracking with barely restrained emotion. "I never intended to cause harm. It was an accident, a terrible, unforeseen accident that occurred in a moment of panic when I feared she was about to run toward danger." "An accident does not excuse your subsequent cowardice," Draven cut in sharply, his controlled composure finally beginning to crack beneath the weight of his justified anger. "You allowed an innocent woman to sacrifice everything, her position, her reputation, her entire life within this pack, to protect you from consequences you should have faced yourself, weeks ago, the moment the incident occurred." "I was frightened," Cassian admitted, tears now streaming freely down his face, as the full weight of his prolonged deception finally broke through his carefully maintained composure. "Frightened of losing my position, of the shame such an accusation would bring upon my family, my aging mother who depends entirely on my continued support, my younger siblings who have no one else to provide for their needs." "And you believed Lyra possessed no similar fears, no similar concerns regarding her own well-being and reputation?" Draven demanded, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. "You allowed her to bear consequences you were too cowardly to face yourself, consequences that nearly cost additional lives when she remained in the outer village during the rogue attack, tirelessly saving villagers while carrying the unjust burden of your betrayal." Cassian sank into a nearby chair, his composure completely shattered now, his entire body trembling with the overwhelming weight of guilt he had carried silently for weeks. Guilt that had finally been exposed fully into the harsh light of undeniable truth. "What will happen to me now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible, resignation evident in every line of his defeated posture. "That remains to be determined," Draven said, his own anger beginning to shift toward the more immediate priority of correcting the profound injustice that had been allowed to continue for far too long already. "But first, I must correct the wrong that has been done to an innocent woman who sacrificed everything to protect you, despite deserving none of the suffering she has endured these past weeks." He turned away from his broken beta, his mind already racing ahead toward the difficult conversation that awaited him, toward the woman whose remarkable strength and selfless sacrifice had finally been vindicated through the truth that had taken far too long to fully emerge into the light. Yet even as he prepared to seek her out, to finally offer the acknowledgement and restoration she so clearly deserved, he remained unaware of the urgent complication that had already begun developing within the outer village, a complication that would soon transform his intended act of justice into something considerably more desperate and time-sensitive than he could have possibly anticipated. Draven remained in his study for a long while after Cassian's departure, the broken beta escorted quietly to confined quarters pending a full-pack council regarding appropriate consequences for his actions. Draven paced slowly before the cold hearth, replaying the entire sequence of events in his mind, from the night of the injury, through the weeks of unjust suspicion cast upon an innocent woman, searching for any moment where he might have paused, questioned more carefully, refused to accept a confession offered too readily to be entirely true. He thought of the many small signs he had dismissed in those early days, Lyra's steady voice trembling only slightly as she claimed responsibility, the way her eyes had flickered briefly toward Cassian before she spoke, a glance he had noticed, yet failed to properly interpret in the chaos and fear of that terrible evening. Hindsight painted the truth in colors so vivid, he wondered how he had missed it for so long. He summoned his advisors that same afternoon, informing them briefly of the situation and his intention to formally restore Lyra's position and reputation within the pack. Some expressed surprise, others quiet relief, several admitting privately that they, too, had harbored doubts about the official story circulating since the incident. None objected to his decision. None dared to, given the clear evidence he now possessed and the moral weight of the injustice that needed correcting. He considered the timing carefully. A public restoration, conducted with appropriate ceremony before the full pack, would serve two purposes at once: clearing Lyra's name definitively, while also demonstrating to every member of the Blackthorn pack that loyalty and honesty would always be recognized and rewarded, regardless of how long the truth took to surface. He began drafting the announcement himself, wanting his own words, rather than a messenger's second-hand account, to carry the weight of this long-overdue correction. Yet even as he worked through the details of how best to honor Lyra's sacrifice, an unfamiliar restlessness continued tugging at his thoughts, an urgency he could not immediately explain. He told himself it stemmed simply from his eagerness to correct the injustice as quickly as possible, to relieve Lyra of the burden she had carried alone for far too long. He did not yet recognize the deeper instinct stirring within him, the protective concern that had been quietly growing since the night of the rogue attack, when he had watched her work tirelessly through exhaustion, to save lives that were not even her responsibility to save. He resolved to travel to the outer village himself the following morning, rather than sending a mere messenger to deliver news of such significance. Lyra deserved to hear the truth restored to her name, directly from the person who had wrongly stripped it away in the first place. It felt, to him, like the very least he owed her after weeks of unwarranted suffering. That evening, he visited Ren once more before retiring, finding her considerably more settled than she had been in weeks. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep finally quieted now that the truth had surfaced and been acknowledged. "Will Lyra come back to the pack house now?" Ren asked hopefully, her golden eyes bright with anticipation. "I hope so," Draven admitted, surprising himself with the genuine warmth in his own voice. "She deserves far better than what she has endured these past weeks, and I intend to make certain the pack understands exactly how much courage her sacrifice truly required." Ren smiled, satisfied with this answer, and settled back against her pillows with the easy contentment of a child whose world had finally been set right again. Draven watched her drift towards sleep, grateful beyond words that his daughter's ordeal, at least, appeared to be nearing its resolution. He did not yet know that miles away, in the outer village, circumstances had already begun shifting into far more dangerous territory, nor that the peaceful resolution he had envisioned for the following morning would instead become a desperate race against time. The Pack Council convened the following morning to determine Cassian's fate, a solemn gathering of senior Pack members seated within the Great Hall, where matters of serious consequence were traditionally decided. Cassian stood before them, stripped of the confident bearing that had once defined his role as the Alpha's most trusted beta, his shoulders bowed with the weight of shame and guilt that had finally caught up with him after weeks of desperate avoidance. Draven presided over the proceedings with careful formality, laying out the full sequence of events for the assembled council members, from the original injury, through Lyra's false confession, through Ren's eventual recovered memory that had finally exposed the truth. He spoke of Derek's witness testimony, of Grace's observation regarding Cassian's suspicious behavior on the evening in question, building a complete and undeniable picture of exactly what had transpired. "I do not deny any of it," Cassian said quietly, when finally given the opportunity to speak in his own defense. "The injury was accidental, born of panic rather than malice, but my subsequent silence, my willingness to allow an innocent woman to suffer in my place, that was a choice I made deliberately, and I have no excuse worthy of forgiveness for that choice." Several council members murmured amongst themselves, some expressing sympathy for the accidental nature of the original injury, others voicing sharper condemnation for the deliberate deception that had followed. Draven listened to the various perspectives with careful attention, weighing the complicated nature of justice that needed to balance both the genuine accident and the deliberate cowardice that had compounded it so significantly. "Cassian Hale," Draven said finally, once all council members had voiced their perspectives, "you are stripped of your position as Beta, effective immediately. You will not be exiled from the pack entirely, given the accidental nature of the original injury and your family's continued dependence on pack resources, but you will serve a period of probation under close supervision, contributing to pack labor and community service until such time as trust might potentially be rebuilt through consistent, honorable conduct." Cassian bowed his head, accepting the judgment without protest, visible relief mixing with continued shame across his defeated features. It was, all present understood, a considerably more merciful judgment than his deception might have warranted, tempered by Draven's understanding of the genuine accident that had originally caused the injury, and by consideration for the innocent family members who depended on Cassian's continued presence within the pack. "You will also personally travel to the outer village," Draven added, "to offer your apology directly to Lyra Voss, acknowledging publicly the sacrifice she made on your behalf, and the injustice she suffered as a result of your prolonged silence." "Yes, my Alpha," Cassian replied quietly, understanding this final requirement as both appropriate consequence and necessary step toward whatever limited redemption might eventually prove possible for him within the pack's continued structure. As the council proceedings concluded, Draven felt a measure of relief at having finally addressed the injustice that had troubled him for weeks. though his relief remained tempered by awareness that the true resolution still required Lyra's formal restoration, a task he intended to complete personally within the coming hours. He gathered a small escort and prepared to depart for the outer village immediately following the council's conclusion, eager to deliver the news himself rather than delaying the correction any longer than absolutely necessary. Ren begged to accompany him, and after brief consideration, Draven agreed, understanding the significance the moment held for his daughter's own emotional healing as well. They traveled quickly through the forest path connecting the main pack territory to the outer village, Draven's mind already composing the words he intended to speak, the formal acknowledgement of Lyra's sacrifice that would finally restore her rightful position and reputation within the broader pack community. He anticipated relief on her part, perhaps cautious disbelief given the harsh treatment she had endured, followed eventually by acceptance of the restoration she so clearly deserved. He did not anticipate the scene that awaited him upon arrival. The village appeared unusually quiet as they approached, a tension in the air that immediately set Draven's instincts on alert. Villagers moved with hurried, worried expressions, gathering near Holly's cottage, with concerned murmurs that carried an unmistakable undertone of distress. "What has happened?" Draven asked a passing villager, his earlier anticipation replaced suddenly by sharp, instinctive concern. "It's the healer," the villager replied, worry evident in her voice. "Lyra. She collapsed this morning, hasn't woken since. Holly says it's exhaustion, maybe worse, from everything she did during the attack. She has not properly rested in days, kept treating patients, even after we all told her to stop and care for herself." Draven's blood ran cold, his carefully composed intentions for the day's visit dissolving instantly beneath a surge of urgent fear that struck him with unexpected force. He moved quickly toward the cottage, Ren hurrying to keep pace beside him, her small face etched with matching concern for the woman who had become such an important source of comfort and friendship during her own difficult recovery. He pushed through the gathered crowd and entered the cottage, finding Holly kneeling beside a small bed where Lyra lay pale and still, her breathing shallow, her skin damp with fever that had clearly been building for some time beneath her continued dedication to treating others, while neglecting her own critical need for rest and recovery. "How long has she been like this?" Draven demanded, kneeling immediately beside the bed, his earlier plans for formal restoration forgotten entirely in the face of this sudden, urgent medical crisis. "She collapsed this morning," Holly explained, her weathered face lined with worry, as she continued applying cool cloths to Lyra's fevered forehead. "But I fear the fever has been building for days, hidden beneath her determination to continue helping others, despite her own exhaustion. She sustained several minor injuries during the rogue attack that she never allowed me to properly treat, too focused on tending to everyone else's wounds to address her own." Draven's chest tightened with a complicated mixture of guilt and fear, understanding suddenly the full weight of what Lyra's selfless dedication had cost her, physically as well as emotionally, throughout the demanding ordeal of the past several days. The very qualities that made her such a remarkable healer, her willingness to prioritize others' needs above her own comfort and safety, had now placed her own life in serious jeopardy. "What do you need?" he asked urgently, his mind racing through every resource the main pack house might offer that could assist in her recovery. "Whatever supplies, whatever additional healers, name it, and it will be provided immediately." "I need herbs that grow only near the northern mountains," Holly said, her expression grave. "A specific combination required to break a fever this severe, particularly when combined with the infection I suspect has developed from her untreated wounds. Without it, I fear her body may not possess sufficient strength to fight through this crisis alone." "How far are the northern mountains?" Draven asked, already calculating the time required for such a journey. "Half a day's travel each way, even moving quickly," Holly replied, "and that assumes favorable conditions throughout the journey." Draven's jaw tightened with fierce determination. "Then I will retrieve them myself. Continue whatever treatment you can provide in the meantime. I will not allow her to suffer any further consequence from a sacrifice that should never have been asked of her in the first place." Without waiting for further discussion, he rose immediately, calling to his escort waiting outside, organizing a swift party to accompany him on the urgent journey toward the northern mountains, determined to retrieve whatever remedy might save the life of the woman whose selfless courage had finally revealed itself as far more valuable than he had initially recognized during those harsh, hasty judgments weeks earlier. Ren remained behind with Holly, holding Lyra's still hand with quiet determination, whispering encouragement to the unconscious healer, despite receiving no response beyond the shallow, labored breathing that continued marking the fragile thread of life Lyra still clung to despite her body's exhaustion. "You have to wake up," Ren whispered fiercely, tears streaming down her young face. "Father is going to fix everything, but you have to hold on until he returns. Please, Lyra, please hold on." Outside, Draven mounted his horse with fierce urgency, his mind consumed entirely by the desperate need to save the woman he had so unjustly condemned weeks earlier, understanding now with painful clarity exactly how much he stood to lose should this race against time prove unsuccessful. He spurred his horse forward, his escort following swiftly behind him, racing toward the northern mountains with a desperation that superseded every other concern that had previously occupied his thoughts throughout the preceding difficult weeks. The formal restoration he had originally planned to deliver personally would have to wait. For now, only one priority mattered above all others: securing whatever remedy might prove necessary to ensure Lyra Voss survived long enough to receive the justice and recognition she had so rightfully earned through her extraordinary, selfless courage. The journey toward the northern mountains proved harder than Draven had anticipated, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as they left the familiar forest paths behind and began climbing steep, rocky trails that tested even his experienced horse's sure footing. He pushed forward relentlessly, ignoring his own growing fatigue, focused entirely on reaching the specific grove of herbs Holly had described in careful detail before his departure. His escort struggled to maintain his punishing pace, several riders falling behind as the trail grew more treacherous, though Draven refused to slow his progress even slightly, driven by an urgency that felt increasingly personal rather than merely dutiful. He found himself thinking, throughout the difficult journey, of every moment he had spent in Lyra's presence since that fateful evening weeks earlier, the quiet dignity she had maintained despite unjust treatment, the selfless dedication she had demonstrated during the rogue attack, the remarkable strength of character that had allowed her to protect Cassian's secret despite tremendous personal cost. He realized, somewhere along that difficult mountain trail, that his feelings toward her had shifted considerably, beyond simple guilt or dutiful correction of injustice. Something deeper had taken root during these recent weeks of investigation and growing understanding, something he had been reluctant to fully acknowledge amid the more immediate concerns of uncovering truth and delivering appropriate justice. He pushed the realization aside for now, focusing entirely on the immediate crisis at hand, though the awareness lingered persistently at the edges of his thoughts throughout the remainder of the difficult journey. They reached the northern grove as afternoon light began slanting golden through the mountain peaks, and Draven dismounted quickly, working alongside his remaining escort to gather the specific herbs Holly had described, careful to identify each plant correctly, despite his limited botanical knowledge compared to trained healers who typically handled such tasks. He worked with focused intensity, gathering far more than the minimum quantity required, unwilling to risk returning with insufficient supplies should complications arise during the treatment process. Once satisfied he had gathered adequate quantities of every required herb, he mounted his horse once more, beginning the equally difficult journey back toward the outer village, pushing his exhausted horse and remaining escort with the same relentless urgency that had carried them toward the mountains in the first place. The return journey felt considerably longer than the outward trip, every passing moment weighted with fear that he might arrive too late, that Lyra's condition might have deteriorated beyond the point where even Holly's skilled treatment could successfully save her. He thought of Ren, waiting anxiously at Lyra's bedside, of the profound loss his daughter would suffer, should this crisis end in tragedy rather than recovery. He thought of the pack itself, of the injustice that would remain forever unresolved should Lyra die before receiving the formal restoration and acknowledgement she so clearly deserved. Most of all, he thought of Lyra herself, of the future he had only just begun to imagine might be possible between them, a future that suddenly felt achingly fragile, given the uncertain outcome of her current medical crisis. Darkness had fully descended by the time they finally reached the outer village once more, Draven's horse lathered with exhaustion, his own body aching from the demanding pace he had maintained throughout the long, difficult day. He rushed immediately toward Holly's cottage, herbs clutched tightly in his hands, his heart pounding with a complicated mixture of hope and dread as he pushed through the door. "I have them," he announced, breathless from his hurried journey, extending the gathered herbs toward Holly, who accepted them immediately with visible relief. "You made excellent time," Holly said, already beginning to prepare the necessary remedy with practiced efficiency. "Her fever has worsened somewhat since your departure, but she remains alive, still fighting despite everything her body has endured." Draven moved to Lyra's bedside, finding Ren still seated there, exhaustion evident in his daughter's young features despite her evident determination to remain by Lyra's side throughout the entire ordeal. He gently guided his daughter toward a nearby chair to rest while he took her place beside the bed, studying Lyra's pale, fevered face with an intensity that surprised even himself. "You must live," he said quietly, taking her limp hand gently within his own. "You have sacrificed enough already. You do not deserve to lose your life on top of everything else you have already given for others." Holly worked quickly, preparing the herbal remedy with careful precision, administering it gradually to the unconscious healer, while Draven and Ren watched anxiously, praying silently for the crisis to finally begin turning toward recovery, rather than continued deterioration. The night stretched long and uncertain, Draven remaining constantly at Lyra's bedside despite Holly's gentle suggestions that he rest, unwilling to leave her side even briefly during such a critical period. He watched every subtle change in her breathing, every flicker of movement beneath her closed eyelids, searching desperately for any sign that the remedy was beginning to take effect. Sometime past midnight, Holly finally offered a measure of cautious encouragement. "Her fever has begun to break," she announced quietly, checking Lyra's temperature with practiced hands. "It remains too early to declare her fully recovered, but this represents significant progress." Relief flooded through Draven with such intensity that he found himself momentarily unable to speak, gratitude and hope combining powerfully as he continued watching over Lyra's still form, hoping desperately that Holly's assessment proved accurate, that the worst of the crisis had indeed finally begun to pass. By dawn, Lyra's breathing had grown steadier, her color slowly beginning to return, despite the continued fever still working its way through her exhausted system. Draven remained at her side throughout the entire night, exhaustion finally catching up with him, as the first light of morning began filtering through the cottage windows, though he refused to leave despite his own obvious need for rest. It was nearly midday when Lyra's eyes finally fluttered open, confusion evident in her weak, disoriented gaze, as she slowly became aware of her surroundings, of the exhausted Alpha King seated faithfully beside her bed, of Ren's relieved smile as she noticed her friend finally awakening after the long, frightening ordeal. "Where am I?" Lyra asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper, throat dry from the extended fever that had ravaged her body over the preceding day and night. "You collapsed from exhaustion and infection," Draven explained gently, relief evident in every line of his tired features. "You have been unconscious for nearly a full day. Holly feared for your life, and I feared it as well, more than I believed myself capable of fearing anything." Lyra absorbed this information slowly, her mind still foggy from the lingering effects of her illness, though something in Draven's expression, in the careful gentleness of his voice, struck her as significantly different from any interaction they had previously shared throughout the difficult weeks of her exile and suspicion. "Why do you seem so troubled by my condition?" she asked, genuine confusion evident in her weak voice. "I am merely a disgraced healer, living in the outer village, of little consequence to the Alpha King's concerns." "You are far more than that," Draven said firmly, his golden eyes meeting hers with unmistakable sincerity. "And I have come to correct a grave injustice that should never have been permitted to continue for as long as it has." He proceeded to explain, gently and thoroughly, everything that had transpired since her collapse, Ren's recovered memory, Cassian's confession, and subsequent punishment, the Pack Council's formal acknowledgement of the truth that had finally emerged after weeks of careful investigation. Lyra listened in stunned silence, tears gathering in her weary eyes, as the weight of vindication finally settled over her exhausted body. "You knew," she said finally, once he had finished his explanation. "You suspected the truth even before Ren's memory returned." "I suspected," Draven confirmed, "though I lacked the concrete proof necessary to act with complete certainty until circumstances finally provided that clarity. I am deeply sorry, Lyra, for the harsh judgment I imposed upon you, that terrible evening, for the weeks of unjust suffering you endured, as a direct result of my hasty decision. You deserved far better treatment than I provided, and I intend to spend considerable effort correcting that grave mistake." Lyra remained silent for a long moment, processing the full weight of his sincere apology, the genuine remorse evident in every word he spoke. "I do not regret my choice," she said finally, her voice growing stronger, as her strength gradually continued returning. "Cassian's family depended on him. I possessed nothing similar to lose, beyond my own reputation and position, which felt, at the time, a fair price to protect innocent people who had done nothing wrong themselves." "Your selflessness nearly cost you your life," Draven said gently, though admiration rather than criticism colored his tone, both during the original sacrifice and during the rogue attack that followed. "You must learn, eventually, to value your own well-being as highly as you value others' needs." Lyra managed a weak, tired smile. "Perhaps, with time, I will learn that lesson. For now, I am simply grateful to be alive, and grateful that the truth has finally been acknowledged." Ren moved closer to the bed, unable to contain her joy any longer, gently embracing Lyra despite Holly's cautionary reminder to be careful of her continued fragile condition. "I am so glad you are safe," she said, tears of relief streaming freely down her young face. "I was so frightened I might lose you, before you ever knew the truth had finally been discovered." Lyra returned the embrace as best her weakened condition allowed, warmth flooding through her chest at the genuine affection this remarkable young girl had shown her throughout their unlikely, secret friendship. "I am not so easily lost," she said softly, though gratitude for the girl's continued devotion remained evident in her tired voice. As the afternoon light continued filtering through the cottage windows, Draven remained close beside Lyra's bed, watching her gradual recovery with an intensity that spoke of feelings considerably deeper than simple guilt or dutiful correction of past injustice. Something had shifted between them throughout this extended ordeal, something neither party had anticipated when this complicated story had first begun weeks earlier, with a single desperate lie told to protect an innocent family from unfair consequences. Neither of them yet knew exactly what shape this new understanding between them might eventually take, though both sensed, with quiet certainty, that whatever future awaited them would look considerably different from the painful circumstances that had first brought them together through injustice and unnecessary suffering. Lyra's recovery continued steadily over the following days, her strength gradually returning under Holly's careful supervision, though Draven found reasons to visit the outer village frequently throughout that period. Official pack business somehow always requiring his personal attention within the settlement that had, weeks earlier, seemed impossibly distant from his usual concerns as Alpha King. Once Lyra had regained sufficient strength to travel safely, Draven arranged for her formal return to the main pack house, insisting on a public ceremony that would fully restore her position and reputation before the entire assembled pack. He wanted no ambiguity remaining regarding the truth, no lingering whispers or unresolved suspicion that might continue casting shadows over her rightful place within the community she had served so faithfully throughout her years as a dedicated healer. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, the entire pack gathering within the great hall to witness the formal proceedings. Lyra stood before the assembled crowd, still somewhat pale from her recent illness, yet radiating quiet dignity despite the nervousness evident in her careful posture. Draven stood beside her, his expression solemn yet warm, as he addressed the gathered pack members. "Weeks ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent hall, "I made a grave error in judgment, condemning an innocent woman, based on a hasty confession, offered to protect someone else entirely. Lyra Voss sacrificed her position, her reputation, and nearly her very life, to shield an innocent family from unjust consequences that should never have fallen upon them in the first place." He continued, describing the full sequence of events that had finally revealed the truth: Ren's recovered memory, Cassian's subsequent confession, the remarkable courage and selflessness Lyra had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal, including her tireless efforts during the rogue attack that had nearly cost her own life through sheer exhaustion and dedication to helping others. "Today," he concluded, "I formally restore Lyra Voss to her rightful position as healer within this pack, with full honor and recognition for the extraordinary sacrifice she made on behalf of others. Let this serve as a reminder to to every member of our community that true strength lies not in power or position, but in the willingness to place others' well-being above one's own comfort and safety. He gestured to Iris, who stepped forward carrying the healer's pendant that had been removed from Lyra's neck weeks earlier, carefully restoring it to its rightful place with reverent ceremony. The assembled crowd erupted into warm applause. Pack members, who had once regarded Lyra with suspicion, now recognizing fully the depth of courage her original sacrifice had truly represented. Lyra felt tears gathering in her eyes as she absorbed the overwhelming warmth of the pack's renewed acceptance, gratitude and relief, combining powerfully after weeks of difficult isolation and unjust suspicion. She caught Ren's proud smile from where the young girl stood near the front of the gathered crowd, and beside her, Holly's warm, encouraging expression, and further back, even Owen's grateful nod, acknowledgement of the life she had saved during the desperate night of the rogue attack. As the formal ceremony concluded and the pack began dispersing into more casual celebration, Draven guided Lyra toward a quieter corner of the great hall, wanting a private moment away from the overwhelming attention of the crowd. "Thank you," Lyra said softly, once they had found a measure of relative privacy. "For everything you have done to correct this injustice, for traveling to retrieve the herbs that saved my life, for the trust you have shown in restoring my position so completely." "You owe me no thanks," Draven replied, his golden eyes warm with genuine affection as he studied her carefully. "If anything, the debt runs entirely in the opposite direction. Your selfless courage saved my daughter's happiness during her recovery, saved countless lives during the rogue attack, and taught me a valuable lesson about the true nature of loyalty and sacrifice that I will carry with me throughout the remainder of my leadership." Lyra felt warmth spreading through her chest at his sincere words, a warmth that extended beyond simple gratitude into something considerably more complicated and unexpected. "What happens now?" she asked, uncertain of what the future might hold, following such a dramatic resolution to the difficult circumstances that had defined the past several weeks of her life. "Now," Draven said, a genuine smile touching his features for perhaps the first time since this entire complicated story had begun, "I hope we might have the opportunity to build something new between us, something founded on the trust and respect you have so thoroughly earned throughout this difficult ordeal, rather than the hasty judgment that originally defined our relationship." Lyra's breath caught slightly at the implication evident in his words, hope and uncertainty combining, as she considered the unexpected possibility he seemed to be suggesting. "I would like that," she said finally, her voice soft yet sincere. In the weeks that followed, Draven and Lyra's relationship continued deepening gradually, built upon the foundation of mutual respect and admiration that had grown throughout the difficult circumstances of her exile and eventual vindication. Ren delighted in watching this unexpected connection blossom between her father and the woman who had become such an important friend during her own recovery, often finding excuses to spend time in both their company simultaneously, quietly pleased by the warmth that continued growing between them. Cassian completed his period of probation with genuine dedication, working diligently to rebuild the trust he had so thoroughly damaged through his initial cowardice, eventually earning a measure of forgiveness from both Draven and Lyra herself, who understood, perhaps better than anyone else within the pack, the complicated fears that had originally driven his difficult choices. The outer village, too, benefited considerably from the resolution of this complicated story, Lyra dividing her time between her restored position within the main pack house and continued support for the smaller settlement that had shown her such genuine kindness during her difficult period of exile. Holly remained a cherished friend and mentor, their bond deepened rather than diminished by Lyra's eventual return to her formal position within the broader pack community. Season after season passed, the pack gradually settling into renewed harmony, following the difficult trials that had tested its unity and values so thoroughly. Draven governed with renewed wisdom, having learned firsthand the dangers of hasty judgment and the profound importance of seeking complete truth before rendering consequential decisions that might affect innocent lives. Lyra, for her part, continued serving as healer with the same dedication and skill that had always defined her calling, though now she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose true worth had finally been recognized and celebrated by the community she had always been determined to serve, regardless of whether that service brought recognition or, as it once had, painful sacrifice instead. And as the bond between Draven and Lyra continued deepening into something that promised lasting partnership and genuine affection, the entire pack watched with quiet approval, understanding that this unlikely union, born from injustice, yet ultimately redeemed through truth and courage, represented exactly the kind of strength and integrity that would continue guiding the Blackthorn pack toward a future built on honesty, loyalty, and the profound recognition that true leadership required not just power, but wisdom enough to recognize and correct one's own mistakes, no matter how difficult that reckoning might prove to be. The story of the healer who took the blame to protect an innocent family, and the Alpha King, who learned the truth only after nearly losing something precious as a result of his own hasty judgment, became something of a legend within the Blackthorn pack, told for generations as a reminder that courage often wears quiet, unassuming faces, and that the truth, however long it takes to surface, always finds its way into the light eventually, rewarding those who choose integrity over self-preservation, and reminding those who judge too quickly that patience and careful investigation will always serve justice far better than hasty, emotional reaction ever could.